So some of you heard the story. I'll start over again. Edward Sheko is a Muslim man, and he was training to be a Muslim apologist. He was becoming an important person where he lived. I met him last year in Malawi, and he is now a pastor in that same area of the country where he's from. And he was converted to be a follower of Jesus. And when he converted, he described himself as being like the Apostle Paul. He was a man who was raging against God, fighting against God, and God reached into his life and changed him. He encountered Jesus. That's the best way to describe it. And because he encountered Jesus, his family tied him up and beat him to try to make him turn back to Islam. And so when I met him, he had learned to count it all joy to be a follower of Jesus in a way that is it's beautiful to behold. And he was one of the pastors who came to Baptist Theological Seminary of Malawi last July when I went there for 2 weeks. And under the principle, it's better late than never, I want to share a little bit about what I did there when I was there last year. There's a pastor's training course. So they brought in 51 pastors from around the country of Malawi and taught them. I was there to teach the Gospels. So we had 2 weeks. Pragmatically, there were 2 groups. One group I taught through a translator, Mr. Ben Chikaoneka, who was a student there. He just graduated, and he actually just got married yesterday, which is pretty neat. Kept a little bit in contact with him. But so he would teach them in Chichewa, which is the common language of the country of Malawi. It's not even the first language of many of the people who were there, but everyone speaks Chichewa mostly in Malawi. The other class I just taught in simple English because they understood English, even if they didn't speak it very well. Edward happened to speak English pretty well, so I got to talk with him a bit more about his life and ministry. So that's what I was there for, to train pastors in learning and teaching the Gospels. And for 2 brief weeks, we labored together on that endeavor. And you know, it's hard, I admit. It was a difficult time. Not because living in Malawi was that terribly difficult. It was different. But it's hard to teach cross-culturally. And there's a lot of things you take for granted when you teach, if you ever have the opportunity to teach. You understand in your own culture the meaning of how you say things certain ways. You understand how to apply the text to people's lives because you know the kind of things that happen in people's lives. Right? A lot of this stuff you just realize in teaching cross-culturally, I don't know any of this. How am I applying the text to these people? How am I helping them understand how to teach the Gospels when in a lot of ways I can't do that with them? It was hard. We're just laboring there and seeking to be spiritually fruitful. You know, just one specific example of one of the difficulties there is teaching about how in the Gospels we're meant to see Jesus as an example and follow after him. So I got a question, which I was expecting to get at some point in time, and the question was this: if we're supposed to follow after Jesus, does that mean we're supposed to heal people like Jesus does? That's not the kind of question I would expect to get in teaching in most places in the U.S. Right? That's not the sort of expectations we have. But that's a real expectation a lot of people have of their pastors in Malawi, that their pastor should be able to come, pray over them, and heal them. Right? There's just a big cultural gap between us. And it's hard to teach cross-culturally, but through this experience, a couple things really stood out to me. One, there's just such a value to robust biblical theological education. So I've been able to have, I'm still having this. So by way of introduction, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Nat Erickson. I'm currently a PhD student in New Testament over in Louisville at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, which means I've been a professional student for a very long time, and the jury's still out if I can do anything in real life. But I at least do well at writing papers. But so this sort of education is very helpful for the life of the church because there's so many things that pastors have to deal with, that leaders in the church have to deal with, to teach people well and to lead them through the difficulties that are culturally specific, but that are all seeking to lead people away from Jesus. And another thing that really just struck out to me is the importance of cross-cultural theological education. A lot of the problems that the church in Malawi, as well as elsewhere in the world, has to face are the fault of Western missionaries and false teachers who came out from Western countries bringing false gospels. But realistically, that's a lot of the problems they have to face are problems that we gave them. And there's a big value in cross-cultural teachers going out and helping these growing churches learn how to understand and teach the Bible for themselves in a more effective and robust way. Taking these 2 points together is just something that's been weighing on my heart and mind as I'm nearing the end of my school. I'm currently writing my dissertation, which will hopefully be done sooner rather than later. And just wondering and praying, is God laying these sorts of ideas on my mind because that's where he wants me and my family to go? And so I would just ask for prayer for our family as we explore and as we try to discern God's call on our lives. And they would have the courage to follow him wherever that be. But back to Edward. Meeting Jesus changes people's lives. He was going to be a Muslim apologist, and now he's a pastor persecuted by the very Muslims that he was going to defend. That's a pretty big change in what he was doing day by day. And in this sermon series, we've been looking at people who encountered Jesus in different ways. And we're going to look today at another encounter, an encounter that gives us a really good picture of what it should look like when someone encounters Jesus. So our passage today is the Gospel of Mark, chapter 10, verses 46 through 52. This is a familiar passage to many of us. I'll just read this now. And they came to Jericho, and as he, Jesus, was setting out from Jericho along with his disciples, a large crowd, a blind beggar, Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, was sitting beside the road. And when he heard that it was Jesus the Nazarene, he began to cry out and say, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And many people warned him that he should be quiet. But he was crying out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And Jesus stopped and said, "Call him." And they called the blind man and said to him, "Have courage, get up. He is calling you." And he threw off his cloak, jumped up, and came to Jesus. And Jesus answered him and said, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "Rabboni, that I may regain my sight." And Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has healed you." And immediately he regained his sight and began to follow him on the road. If you would pray with me. God, we know that there are many eyes that need to be opened. And we pray that today your Spirit would open our eyes to see how your word is meant to pierce us and to reshape us, that we may follow after Jesus as you have called us to. God, it is in your name that we ask. Amen. So as we read this passage in Mark, we need to appreciate that everything in Mark has been leading up to this point. Since chapter 1, we've been seeing Jesus on his ministry, going around the countryside, healing, teaching, confronting religious leaders, doing all sorts of things. He's been busy performing his work, his ministry. And the high point of everything so far was in Mark chapter 8, verse 29. And that's where Peter says, "Jesus, you are the Christ, the Son of God." Right after this climactic point, Jesus shakes everything up. He turns and he starts teaching, "It is necessary for the Son of Man to be rejected, to be killed, and to rise again after 3 days." So the bit of insight that we see Peter has into who Jesus is still so far short of who Jesus truly is, the totality of Jesus. And Jesus starts taking time to teach them about who he is and what he's actually about. He does this 2 more times in the Gospel of Mark, teaching it's necessary for the Son of Man to suffer, to die, and to be raised again. Most notably, verses 32 through 34 of chapter 10. That's the 3rd time he does this while they're on the way up to Jerusalem. And what we see is that the looming crucifixion is the driving force in the Gospel of Mark. That's where everything is heading towards. Jesus is the Christ, but he's not the Christ like anyone was expecting. He's the Christ who's going to Jerusalem to die. What it means to understand him and what he's about means to understand that's his road. His road is the one to Jerusalem, to suffer, to die, and then to be raised. So in verse 46, we see that Jesus and company, so his disciples, as well as the crowd of people who are going up with him to Passover in Jerusalem, are on the road, and they come to Jericho. And immediately after we're introduced to Jesus traveling, the focus of this passage shifts away from Jesus onto Bartimaeus, who becomes basically the main character in this story. And that's not insignificant. Jesus is usually the clear main actor in every story in the Gospels. And Bartimaeus steps up into the spotlight with Jesus in this account. He's described for us in a few key ways. We're told he's blind. We're not told that once. We're not told that twice. We're told that 3 times in this passage. Right? We're also told he's a beggar and that he's seated by the road. And all 3 of these descriptions become really significant at multiple levels that we'll unpack as we go along. But basically, Bartimaeus is a destitute man. He's blind. He can't participate fully in the life of his community. He can't participate fully in the religion that he even is a member of. He may have previously had his sight. That's open to interpretation in the Greek. It's unclear, but he's clearly blind, and that's never let far out of our minds. But Bartimaeus clearly had heard about Jesus. Right? He's blind. He's not deaf. He knows what's going on. There's a lot of stories in the air about Jesus. Jesus can heal people. Jesus has raised people from the dead. Jesus is a great teacher. Jesus has healed blind people. Just imagine the sorts of things Bartimaeus thinks and feels knowing that Jesus can do this. And that's the very Jesus who's on the road right now. So the time for speculative thinking for Bartimaeus is over. Jesus is somewhere in the crowd. So he acts, and he starts yelling out loudly, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Now, it's interesting that Bartimaeus is yelling and making a big scene. That would not have been a normal, expected way for a person to behave in his culture. But what's even more interesting is what he's saying. This is the first time in the Gospel of Mark that Jesus is called Son of David. That happens one more time in Mark chapter 12, where Jesus and the religious leaders are disputing over the identity of the Messiah. And he refers to Psalm 110, where the religious leaders say, the Son of David is the Messiah. Right? So what we see in that little exchange there is the name Son of David meant to them Messiah. That's what it meant to call someone Son of David. The expected deliverer sent by God to his people. And there's nothing in the gospel so far that's prepared us to hear Son of David as a title for Jesus, especially from the lips of a stranger. In fact, one of the interesting things about the Gospel of Mark is it emphasizes how careful Jesus is in preventing people from calling him Messiah or other names of that type. When Peter confesses that he is the Christ, right after that, Jesus turns to them and commands the disciples to tell no one. And we're told several times through how Jesus tells people not to tell people who he is. And this is the very first time in the Gospel of Mark where someone publicly identifies Jesus as Messiah. And here it's a blind man on the side of the road outside of Jericho. Now, it would be an interesting historical question of the sort that New Testament scholars spend a lot of time writing about how Bartimaeus came up with this title for Jesus. I think a lot more significant for us is to ask, how are we as Christ's followers, when we're reading the Gospel of Mark, how are we meant to understand this? That suddenly a blind man sees who Jesus is. There's something ironic and theologically rich about what happens in this passage. The blind man is the one who sees most clearly. Knowing Jesus apparently is not achieved by seeing, but by seeing in some other sense. Right? The most profound truths about who Jesus is are not achieved by seeing his life, but by some sort of spiritual sight. And just practically for us, there's something that should encourage us in that truth, as well as, it's a troubling truth as well. But as we as a church have been striving to proclaim the gospel explicitly in our community this summer, and I hope for the ongoing continuation of we as a fellowship of believers, we've been walking around trying to share the gospel with people. I know many of you have been out on Wednesday nights. Some of you may be talking to your neighbors, to people at the airport, whoever. It's a blessing to see the body reach out like this, but there can be a real temptation in the midst of this gospel effort to start to think, man, we're doing this, and I've shared this with so many people, and no one has responded. And we're all this effort going out, and it doesn't seem like people are banging down the doors of the church to repent and turn to Jesus. And these are real questions that can become a discouragement in the sort of spiritual effort it requires to share the gospel. It can just debilitate. And I want us to be encouraged from this passage in the Gospel of Mark today that seeing Jesus is different than seeing Jesus. What we see in this passage today. It's not with the eyes of flesh. It's not our job to convince people who Jesus is. There are no amount of questions you can answer. There are no amount of facts you can give. You can't even transport someone back in time and have them see the ministry of Jesus to convince them about who he is. Because a lot of people lived that and didn't believe him, right? It's good to learn more, to know how to answer more questions, to be able to have a greater spiritual insight into what are the resistance people have. Those are all great things that we should pursue. We also just have to embrace that at the end of the day, God has to do something in order for people to see who Jesus is. God has to open up eyes in a way that we can't in order for people to know who Jesus is. And it's not our job to wrestle people into the kingdom of God. It's our job to be faithful as his followers, heralding the King and trusting that God, who is able to open blind eyes, can take care of people seeing who his Son is. And I hope that truth can be freeing to us as we continue on Wednesday nights for the next couple of weeks, as well as, we've got a lifetime ahead of all of us where God expects us to be faithful in heralding the gospel. And I want to share, I was in Campus Crusade for Christ during college, and we had a definition of successful evangelism that we were given that I just want to share with you. I think it hits the nail right on the head. Successful evangelism is taking the initiative and the power of the Holy Spirit to share the gospel and leaving the results to God. That's what we're to do. We serve a God who is able to make blind eyes see. And that should be enough for us. He just calls us to be faithful in holding Jesus up for those to see who God enables to see. Now, back in the text, Jesus hears the man screaming, and over the hubbub of the crowd, Jesus hears him, and he tells the crowd, call him. Now, it's striking that in the midst of a huge crowd, in the midst of a long journey, Jericho to Jerusalem is a long walk. Right? They got a long way to go. But Jesus stops what he's doing and listens to this one blind man. And it's significant how Jesus consistently has time for those who you wouldn't expect have a legitimate claim on his time. Jesus has time, attention, and most importantly, compassion for this hurting blind man along the side of the road. That's one of the really big surprises of the gospel, that what it means for Jesus to be the Son of David is very different than what a lot of people were expecting him to be. Bartimaeus probably doesn't even grasp this fully. What it means for Jesus to be the Son of David is that he is primarily there to give attention and compassion and time to the hurting people, to the ones who are broken, to the ones who are lost. Jesus says, I came to seek and save the lost, not the righteous. I've come to bind up the hurting, not the well. That's one of the great surprises of Jesus' first coming is He's not there to deal with the people who think they have life together. He's there to deal with the people who are destitute. And he consistently has time for those who are destitute. The heart of Jesus is to heal, to restore, to usher in God's kingdom restoration into lives that are broken. And to those who recognize that they need him and they need to cry out for new life, to Jesus. And it's worth considering as we read this text. Is Jesus' heart the pattern for our heart? Jesus was oriented towards the hurts and the needs and the brokenness in the world around him. Bartimaeus probably looked and lived a lot like the people we see today on the side of the road, holding up a sign that says, I need help for this or that reason. And it's very easy to sit in condemnation and judgment over these people. Sure, I give them money, they're going to go buy drugs or alcohol. Sure, they probably made a bunch of stupid decisions. Maybe they're lazy, whatever it be. It's really easy to think of a lot of reasons not to see them with true eyes. And I'm not saying there's an easy answer to how we as followers of Jesus should interact with people sitting on the side of the road, people we know have hurts in their lives. I don't know if there's an easy answer. But what I am saying is that as Jesus' followers, we need to actually see these people in the way that Jesus seemed to. We need to actually have eyes that are open and compassionate hearts for people in the world around us who are hurting. So that's what Jesus showed us is the way that he walked. Jesus had time for a blind beggar, Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, on the side of the road. Do we have that kind of heart? Back in the text, in verse 49, we see the crowd says to Bartimaeus, Jesus is calling you, get up, go to him. And there's a great richness in the image of a blind man throwing his cloak aside and going to Jesus. And I think that's worth meditating on and considering, but for sake of time, we're not going to address that right now. But after Bartimaeus comes to Jesus, the question Jesus asks him is an amazing question. Jesus simply asks, what do you want me to do for you? He doesn't ask, what do you believe I can do for you? He doesn't ask, what do you think would be nice? What in your life would you like improvement if it could happen? He just asks, what do you want? Man, what is the desire of your heart that needs to be met? And Bartimaeus, we're told again, he's again called the blind man. We already know who's involved, but emphasized again, he's blind, that's who he is, and he has one desire, one thing on his heart. He says, Rabbi, I want to see. I want to see. This is the peak of the story here. The tension is palpable. If we've read the Gospel of Mark to this point, we know Jesus can heal him. We know Jesus has the power to do that. But will Bartimaeus be like the people in Jesus' hometown who were told Jesus didn't do any miracles there because they lacked faith? But the tension is the story is resolved as Jesus speaks. Go, your faith has delivered you. And with those sounds, the darkness lifts from his eyes, and Bartimaeus is no longer a blind man. That name doesn't work for him anymore. Bartimaeus has been reborn, as it were. He's now the man that Jesus has cited. That's not where the story ends, though. It doesn't end on the triumphant note of Jesus healing. And that's a pretty exciting spot. It ends with Bartimaeus' response to what happened. And Bartimaeus' response is pretty noteworthy. There are 5 other times, besides this passage in the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus heals someone and then tells them, go. And each time, they go, just like he says. The Syrophoenician woman who he cast a demon out of her daughter, she goes home. The man who was paralyzed picks up his mat and goes home. Every other time, they all go, just like Jesus says. Basically, when he says, go, your faith has healed you, what Jesus means is, go home. We're done here. You're healed. That's not what Bartimaeus does. He doesn't go. Instead, we're told Bartimaeus began to follow him on the way. And that quite literally means Bartimaeus gets up and walks to Jerusalem with Jesus, which is where they're all going for the Passover feast. But it's more significant than just that. These are terms of discipleship when you look around in the Bible, following someone in the way. In fact, in the book of Acts, the early church, one of the ways they describe their beliefs and their practice is the way. They're the people of the way. They're following in the way. And the text here, when we read it, emphasizes Bartimaeus acts really immediately, but then he keeps on acting. Throughout this passage, Bartimaeus shouted out. He jumps up. He goes to Jesus. He throws off his cloak. But here at the end, we're told he starts immediately, but it's presented in such a way that he keeps doing it. Right? This becomes a description of what Bartimaeus does. He is now someone who's following Jesus. No longer is he the blind beggar sitting by the side of the road. He's the seeing man following in the way of Jesus. The only thing the same about Bartimaeus at the end of the story from the beginning is his name. Everything else about him has changed because he encountered Jesus. Now, it's no accident that this story stands where it does in the Gospel of Mark. It's in the same spot in the Gospel of Matthew and in the Gospel of Luke, right before Jesus' Passion Week, where he enters Jerusalem. Now, in one sense, it makes historical sense. They're almost to Jerusalem. Jericho's a ways away, but it's pretty close. So it makes sense that historically it's here. But we can see as we read the Gospels, the evangelists move things around all over the place elsewhere. So we need to ask, why put this story here? Didn't Jesus do anything else interesting on the way to Jerusalem that they could have written about? I want to suggest to you that this account is really meant to be a pictorial summation of how we're supposed to encounter Jesus. Right? We've hit this point reading through Gospel of Mark that we've seen who Jesus is and what Jesus is about. We've seen his ministry. We're at the end of his ministry. We're entering into his Passion Week. We've seen it. We've read it. And now the question is put before us, what will you now do with this Jesus? You've seen him. You've heard him. What are you going to do? Will you see in faith and follow Jesus along the way? Bartimaeus becomes an image of what it means to encounter Jesus. Complete transformation. When we look back through the account, we see the three brief descriptions of Bartimaeus and how they're significant for telling us the point of the story. We were introduced to a blind man, yet it turns out that he saw more clearly than anyone else present, and because of his spiritual sight, he runs to Jesus for healing, and he receives physical sight. We're introduced to a man who is a beggar, and as a beggar, he cries out to Jesus for mercy, for a gift that he needs, that he can't get any other way. So he comes to Jesus as a beggar, and he leaves rich. Earlier in this chapter, the rich man comes to Jesus, and he can't give up his riches, so he leaves Jesus poor. Bartimaeus, we're told, is sitting on the side of the road, nowhere to go. Yet he ends up, after encountering Jesus, following along in the way. And it's that road, that way of Jesus, that I want to land on today. As I mentioned earlier, it's no secret to the reader of the Gospel of Mark what the way of Jesus is. He is on the way to Jerusalem to be crucified. That's the way of Jesus. For Bartimaeus to follow on this way means he's following Jesus to the cross. The way of Jesus is the way of the rejected, persecuted Lord, the crucified one. The way of Jesus is a way that's going towards death, towards suffering, in the true knowledge that it is through death and suffering that life comes, but it is a way of suffering. The way of Jesus is a cross shape. It's no accident, and it's no catchy metaphor when Jesus tells his disciples, to follow me, you have to take up your cross and follow me. We're all in danger here today, right now. And that's not a way we're accustomed to thinking about our lives. And I don't mean it's very likely that people are going to burst through the door and demand that we recant from following Jesus, or they'll kill us or torture us or imprison us. There are people around the world who are in that danger. That's not the danger that is so real and present for us. And the danger that encompasses us for our lives is simply this. We're faced with the danger of assuming that we can be a disciple of Jesus without following him on the way to Calvary. We're in danger of believing that we can receive healing from Jesus without being transformed by Jesus in a total way that changes everything about our lives. The encounter Jesus has with people is one that not only gives sight, but it sets the feet in motion. It sets people along the way following after him. We tend to like the benefits of following Jesus and maybe not so much the total transformation act of it. You know, it's great and it's awesome to love that Jesus is our comforter, who gives us strength in time of difficulties, who lifts us up when we are broken, who binds us up. And these are beautiful, incredible truths about who Jesus is for us and who Jesus is to us. And yet they are not the whole truth about who Jesus is to us and who Jesus is for us. That same Jesus who binds up our hurts tells us to do the most painful thing that we can ever do: lose your life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel. Because that's the only way you find life. And that's one of those sayings of Jesus that should both send chills down our spines as well as set our hearts on fire. Right? That's the way to true life, is to die. And I'm inclined to think that in our relatively comfortable Western church and world, we tend to take Jesus' sayings, these stark sayings, as metaphorical, as hyperbolic to get attention. Hey, I'm pretty important. But I can't help but conclude as I read and study the Bible more that Jesus is actually serious when he says, you need to die to follow me. You have to lose your life in following Jesus. He's just as serious in calling me to lose my life as he was when he called Edward Sheko to follow him and be beaten by his father, tied up by his family, and rejected. He didn't give us different callings. He called us to the same thing, to lose our lives in following after him. Jesus opens eyes. He physically healed blind people, but the most profound way in which Jesus opens eyes is not giving physical sight. You can live without physical sight. The most profound way Jesus opens eyes is open spiritual eyes. You can't live true life without having spiritual eyes opened. And Jesus opens eyes in such a way that not only can we see who he is, but we can come to see and grasp that losing our life for him is a beautiful thing. That's the path to hope, to love, to true beauty, to true joy. Christ enables us to see that following in the footsteps of Jesus to death for his sake and for the sake of the gospel is actually the way that we find life. You know, when I was in Malawi, I shook hands with and I talked with this man, Edward Sheko. And in Malawi, when you're talking with someone and they shake hands, they just keep holding onto your hand for the whole time you talk, which is really awkward from my perspective, but at cross-cultural ministry, you do awkward things. So I shook hands with this man who quite literally was beaten by his father because he encountered Jesus, and he has come to understand what it means to follow after him, right? You actually give up everything to follow after Jesus. Jesus has opened my eyes to, and your eyes, if you're his follower, for that same reason. Right? You may not be beaten by your parents. You may not be rejected. We may not have to physically suffer. But he has still called us to lose everything about who we are, about what we do, to give everything and follow after him. That's the way of Jesus. In a minute, we're going to have a time of invitation, and I just want you to think about a couple things. For some of you, it might be that you've never actually seen Jesus. Right? You haven't had your spiritual sight opened to see who Jesus truly is. And that's, this might be the day where Jesus is there for you to see and to cry out, Lord, have mercy on me. For those of us who are already following him on the way, I invite us to consider how seeing Jesus is continually shaping our lives, is continually setting our feet in motion. We have a profound tendency to develop spiritual cataracts that enable us to lose sight of the way that Jesus actually walked, that we're supposed to be walking on. And we can wander and deviate on our own different paths. So I invite you today to consider afresh, crying out, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And to look up again to see Jesus and see the path that he has called us to follow on.